South Atlantic, December 1939. A weapon was created that would forever change the course of naval combat. This wasn't just any shell. It was the deadliest naval shell ever designed, capable of tearing through the thickest armor and tearing battleships apart. Weighing nearly a ton, it was engineered with terrifying precision to penetrate and destroy, unleashing devastation on an unimaginable scale. The creation of this one-ton explosive was a deadly leap forward in military technology, a weapon built not just to sink ships, but to obliterate everything inside. This is the story of how the deadliest shell ever made was built, tested, and unleashed to rewrite naval warfare. Deep inside the steelworks of Essen, Germany, a group of engineers faced a challenge like no other. The task was simple, in theory: design a weapon capable of sinking a battleship, but these weren't just any battleships. By the mid-30s, ships like the British HMS Hood and the German Bismarck had become floating fortresses. Their hulls were wrapped in armor so thick that nothing seemed capable of piercing it. Conventional shells simply bounced off, rendering traditional weapons ineffective. The engineers at the Krupp Steelworks knew they had to create something different. They began with a shell, but not just any shell. They needed a weapon that could punch through the thickest armor and destroy the heart of these giants. The first step was to design a casing strong enough to survive the impact of being fired from a massive naval gun. The steel had to be both hard and tough, hard enough to penetrate the battleship's armor and tough enough not to shatter upon impact. It was a balancing act, a task that felt impossible. Creating something that could withstand the force of being fired at high velocity and still maintain its integrity seemed like science fiction. The engineers at Krupp were working with the best materials they could find. Steel that would endure temperatures so high that the air around them shimmered from the heat. It took weeks to forge each shell. The steel was heated in furnaces, hammered into shape, reheated, and cooled in precise patterns to align the molecular structure. The idea was to create something stronger, something that didn't exist in nature. As they held the shells in their hands, they could feel it, the weight of the metal, the weight of history. They weren't just making ammunition. They were creating a weapon of unimaginable power. But the casing was only half of the story. The next step was even more critical, filling the shell with the explosives that would bring it to life. The Germans were not using simple gunpowder. No, they needed something far more powerful. Inside each shell, they packed over 300 pounds of explosives, a mixture of TNT, ammonium nitrate, and a substance known as shellite. These chemicals were volatile, unstable, and dangerous to handle. A single spark could cause a catastrophic explosion, but the engineers had no choice. The power needed to penetrate battleship armor demanded it. The explosives had to be tightly packed, compressed into a space barely bigger than a trash can. But this small cavity would contain enough force to destroy anything it touched. Creating this kind of weapon required precision at every step. One of the greatest challenges was designing a fuse that would ensure the shell exploded at the right moment. If the fuse went off too soon, the shell would detonate before it could even penetrate the armor. Too late, and it would pass completely through the ship without causing any damage. This was the nightmare that kept the engineers awake at night. They needed a fuse that could survive the brutal forces of being fired from a massive naval gun and then wait for the exact moment to trigger an explosion deep inside the enemy vessel. The solution they came up with was nothing short of genius. The fuse had to be able to survive over 40,000 Gs of force when the shell was fired from the gun. That was more than enough to crush a human body. But the fuse needed to endure this brutal shock and remain intact. Once it reached the ship, it had to penetrate the steel hull, travel deep inside the ship and only then trigger the explosion. This small mechanism, known as the delay action fuse, was a masterpiece of engineering. At the tip of the fuse was a tiny vial of acid. When the shell hit the target, the vial would break open, releasing the acid and beginning to eat through a thin metal barrier. This process took about 3 seconds. Once the barrier dissolved, the detonator would fire, and the chain reaction would begin. The fuse was designed to detonate the shell at the most lethal moment. This was the beginning of a new era in naval warfare. The men working on this project knew they were creating something that could change the course of the war. They didn't fully understand just how powerful this new weapon would be, but they knew it would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. The shell they were building was more than just a piece of artillery. It was an engineering marvel, designed not just to pierce the thickest armor, but to unleash hell once it reached its target. As the work progressed, the engineers began to realize the true potential of their creation. They had designed a weapon that could destroy everything in its path. The shell would not only pierce the battleship's armor, but would create a chain reaction of explosions that could tear a ship apart from the inside. The energy released by the explosion would propel fragments of the shell casing outward, turning them into high-speed projectiles capable of slicing through steel bulkheads, pipes, wires, and anything else in their path. These fragments, some as large as a man's hand, would ricochet off surfaces, tearing through flesh, creating secondary explosions and spreading destruction throughout the ship. The true horror of this weapon was not just in its ability to penetrate armor. It was in its ability to tear a ship apart from the inside, to create a chain of explosions that would leave nothing behind but twisted metal, fires, and death. The engineers didn't just want to destroy the ship, they wanted to ensure that nothing would survive. It was a terrifying thought, but it was the reality they were building. As the first shells were completed, the German Navy began to prepare for the moment when they would be unleashed. These shells were no longer just weapons. They were symbols of a new kind of warfare. They would change everything. The world would soon witness the devastating power of these massive shells. The story of how they would be used in combat is one of terror, destruction, and a new kind of naval warfare that would forever alter the course of history. As the shells began to take shape, the engineers in Essen realized that what they were creating wasn't just a new weapon, it was a revolution in naval warfare. The new shell wasn't like anything that had ever been seen before. It was larger, more powerful, and more deadly than anything in existence. But creating a weapon that could defeat the world's strongest battleships required more than just raw firepower. It required precision. Every step of the process had to be perfect. Even the slightest error could lead to a failed weapon, a wasted effort. The stakes were high, and the pressure was immense. The engineers started by perfecting the shell's casing. They had already decided that the steel had to be tough and strong, but it also had to be shaped in a way that would allow the shell to survive the extreme forces of being fired from a naval gun. The shell's design was nothing like traditional artillery. It wasn't just a simple cylindrical casing with explosives inside. Instead, it was a precision-crafted tool made to perform one very specific job: punch through thick armor and destroy everything inside. The process of forging these shells took weeks, sometimes even months. The steel used to form the shell was heated to temperatures so high that it seemed to glow. The metal was hammered into shape, reheated, and then carefully cooled. Each shell had to go through this process over and over again. Every piece of steel had to be treated in such a way that it could withstand the tremendous force of being fired from a massive naval gun. The cooling process was especially important. If it wasn't done perfectly, the steel could become too brittle or too soft, rendering the shell useless. But if the engineers did it right, The result would be a shell tough enough to penetrate the thickest armor and survive the shock of impact. Once the steel casing was ready, the next challenge was to fill it with explosives. The amount of high explosive packed into each shell was staggering. Over 300 pounds of TNT, ammonium nitrate, and shellite were compressed into a small cavity inside the shell. These chemicals were highly unstable, meaning that the slightest mistake could cause a massive explosion in the factory. The explosive materials had to be carefully measured and packed in just the right way. Too much or too little, and the shell would either fail to penetrate or detonate prematurely. Everything had to be precise, from the amount of explosive to the way it was arranged inside the casing. The engineers didn't just have to create a shell that could penetrate a battleship's armor. They had to ensure that the explosion would cause maximum damage once it hit the target. To accomplish this, the Germans turned to another brilliant piece of engineering, the fuse. The fuse was the key to the entire design. It wasn't just about triggering the explosion. It had to ensure that the explosion occurred at exactly the right moment. The fuse had to survive the brutal forces of firing, then travel deep into the ship's hull, and only then, after penetrating the armor, trigger the explosion. This was no simple task. The fuse had to withstand forces that could crush a human body, forces that were over 40,000 times the force of gravity. The fuse had to be able to survive the intense shock of firing from a naval gun and still function properly once it reached the target. The solution the engineers came up with was a delay-action fuse, a mechanism that would wait until the shell had penetrated the ship's armor before detonating. The fuse was small, but it contained a tiny vial of acid that would break open when the shell hit its target. The acid would eat through a thin metal barrier inside the fuse, and once the barrier was gone, the detonator would fire, setting off the explosive charge inside the shell. This tiny vial of acid was the key to the entire design. It had to work perfectly, or the shell would fail to explode at all. The delay-action fuse was an engineering marvel, and it would be tested under the harshest conditions imaginable. But even with the shell casing, explosives, and fuse all working together, there was still one more problem to solve. The shell had to be able to penetrate the thick armor of enemy battleships. The Germans knew that simply firing a shell at the armor wouldn't work. The shell had to be designed in a way that would allow it to pierce through the steel without shattering. The solution was a ballistic cap, a small piece of softer steel attached to the front of the shell. The cap would spread the impact force, allowing the harder steel of the shell to punch through the armor. This was a brilliant solution, but it didn't stop there. The shell also had to be aerodynamically stable during flight, ensuring that it would hit the target with maximum force. The Germans developed a second cap, a ballistic cap that streamlined the shape of the shell for better flight stability. The combination of these two caps allowed the shell to strike the armor at the right angle and with the right force, ensuring that it would penetrate the ship's defenses. By the time these shells were ready to be tested, they were nothing short of extraordinary. The engineers in Essen had created a weapon that combined the best of both science and art. They had crafted a shell capable of penetrating the thickest armor, exploding with deadly force, and spreading destruction throughout the ship. But the question remained, would it work in battle? The first tests were successful, but they were nothing compared to what was coming. In the coming months, these shells would be loaded into the guns of the German pocket battleships and fired at the enemy. The true test of their power was yet to come. As the German Navy prepared to unleash this new weapon, they knew that they had created something that would change naval warfare forever. The world was about to witness the birth of a new kind of terror on the high seas. By the time the massive shells were ready to be used, the German engineers were facing the final hurdle in their design. The shell itself was a masterpiece, capable of piercing the thickest armor and unleashing unimaginable destruction. But one crucial element still had to be perfected: the fuse. It wasn't enough to simply create a powerful shell. It had to explode at the precise moment, deep inside the enemy ship, to cause maximum damage. This required a fuse that could survive the brutal shock of being fired from a naval gun, travel deep into the ship's interior, and detonate only after the shell had punched through the armor. This was a challenge unlike any other. The engineers had already solved the problem of the shell's design and the explosive force inside. Now, the task was to make sure that the fuse triggered the explosion at exactly the right moment. If the fuse detonated too early, the explosion would happen outside the ship, wasting the shell's power. If it detonated too late, the shell would pass through the ship, leaving a hole without causing any damage. To make matters even more complicated, the fuse had to survive the extreme forces of being fired from a massive naval gun. The solution was a delay-action fuse, a small but crucial mechanism that would delay the explosion until the shell had penetrated the ship's armor. The delay was designed to give the shell time to travel deep into the enemy ship, where it could cause the most destruction. This fuse was an engineering marvel in itself. It was small enough to fit into the shell, but it contained a tiny vial of acid that would break open on impact. Once the acid began eating through a thin metal barrier inside the fuse, the detonator would fire, setting off the shell's explosive charge. The delay-action fuse had to survive forces that could easily crush a human body. When the shell was fired, the fuse would experience more than 40,000 Gs of force. This was enough to turn a person into paste. Yet, the fuse had to endure these forces without breaking, and then, after penetrating the thick armor of the enemy ship, trigger the explosion at the right moment. It was a delicate balance of engineering, and if any part of the process failed, the shell would not work as intended. The fuse had to be perfect, or the entire weapon would fail. As the engineers worked on perfecting the fuse, they began to realize the importance of every small detail. The fuse had to survive the shock of being fired from the gun and then travel through the ship, making sure that it didn't detonate too early. The timing had to be precise. Once the fuse had traveled through the armor, it had to trigger the explosion exactly where it would do the most damage. This delay-action fuse was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was the key to ensuring that the shell would explode at the right moment, unleashing its full destructive power. The engineers knew that if this fuse worked, it would change the way naval battles were fought. The power of the shell, combined with the precision of the fuse, would make traditional naval armor seem useless. The Germans had created a weapon that could penetrate even the most heavily armored battleships, triggering a chain reaction of explosions inside the ship. The fuse was the final piece of the puzzle, and without it, the entire weapon would be useless. The first test of these new shells came soon after the engineers had perfected the design. The shells were loaded into the massive naval guns of the German pocket battleships, ready to be fired at enemy ships. The tension was palpable. The engineers and naval officers who had worked on the project knew that this moment could change everything. If the shells performed as expected, they would forever alter the course of naval warfare. But if they failed, it would be a devastating setback. The first test shots were fired, and the results were nothing short of extraordinary. The shells punched through the thick armor of the target ships, and the delay-action fuse worked perfectly. The shells detonated deep inside the ships, unleashing a force of destruction that no one had anticipated. The explosion was so powerful that it seemed to tear the ships apart from the inside. The fuses worked flawlessly, triggering the explosion at the exact moment to cause maximum damage. It was a moment of triumph for the engineers and the German Navy. Their creation had lived up to its potential, and the world would soon see its terrifying power in action. But the true test was still ahead. The shells were about to be used in a real battle, one that would determine whether they could live up to their reputation. On May 24, 1941, during the Battle of the Denmark Strait, the German battleship Bismarck would fire one of these shells at the British flagship HMS Hood. The shell would penetrate the thick armor of the hood, detonating just next to the ship's ammunition magazines. The explosion was so massive that the hood was torn in half. Of the 1,418 men aboard, only 3 survived. This moment would forever prove the deadly effectiveness of these shells and their delay-action fuses. The power of these weapons was like nothing the world had ever seen before. The fuses worked exactly as they were designed to, detonating the shells at the most lethal moment. The HMS Hood was destroyed in a matter of seconds, demonstrating the terrifying potential of these new shells. For the first time, the full power of German engineering was unleashed on the world stage. The success of the fuses would lead to more tests and more battles, but the outcome was always the same. These shells, combined with their precise fuses, became the ultimate weapon in naval warfare. The German Navy had created a weapon that could penetrate any armor, destroy any ship, and leave nothing behind but wreckage. The delay-action fuse was the key to their success, and it marked the beginning of a new era in naval combat. With each passing day, the shells became more refined, and their devastating power became more apparent. The fuse, the final piece of the puzzle, had turned the shell into a weapon of mass destruction. As the war raged on, these deadly shells would continue to wreak havoc on the seas, proving that precision engineering and careful design could create weapons of unimaginable power. The delay-action fuse, small yet deadly, had become a symbol of the new era of warfare. And as the engineers who had created it watched from the sidelines, they knew they had changed the world forever. The year 1941 brought the world to a breaking point. The tensions of war had reached an all-time high, and naval battles were now being fought with weapons that could change everything. On May 24, 1941, the German battleship Bismarck, armed with the new, deadly shells that had been perfected, sailed into the Denmark Strait. On the horizon, the British flagship HMS Hood awaited. It was the largest and most powerful warship in the Royal Navy, and for the British, it symbolized the might of their fleet. But what the crew of the Hood didn't know was that a weapon far more powerful than anything they had faced before was aimed directly at them. The Bismarck, with its mighty guns, fired the first shell. This wasn't just any shell. It was one of the massive 15-inch armor-piercing shells that had been designed to tear apart ships. The shell was loaded with over 300 pounds of high explosives, packed into a casing that had been forged in the furnaces of Essen. Once fired, the shell hurtled through the air, its path guided by a complex system of fire control, and at the speed of over 2,000 feet per second, it struck the Hood's deck. The moment the shell hit, it was more than just an impact. It was the beginning of the end for the mighty cruiser. The shell didn't simply bounce off the Hood's armor like previous shells might have. Instead, it tore through the deck as if the steel had been paper. The delay-action fuse worked as it was designed, waiting until the shell had passed through the armor and traveled deep into the ship's interior. Once inside, the fuse triggered the explosion. The result was catastrophic. The shell detonated near the ammunition magazines, causing an explosion so massive that it split the Hood in two. The power released by the explosion was enough to send the ship to the ocean floor within minutes. Of the 1,418 men aboard, only 3 survived. The rest were either vaporized in the initial blast, crushed as the ship folded in on itself, or trapped below deck as water rushed in, sinking the wreckage into the cold depths of the ocean. The destruction of the Hood was a shock to the British Navy and the world. It proved that the new German shells were not only capable of penetrating the thickest armor, but could cause catastrophic damage once inside. The explosion was so powerful that it destroyed a ship that had been considered invulnerable. The fuse had worked perfectly. It had detonated the shell at the most lethal moment, just after it had pierced the Hood's armor, and the explosion had spread like wildfire throughout the ship. The result was a total destruction, a testament to the deadly engineering behind the weapon. The loss of the Hood was a major blow to the British Navy. It wasn't just a loss of a ship, it was a loss of a symbol of British naval strength. The Hood had been a cornerstone of the Royal Navy, and its sinking marked a turning point in the war. The British realized that no ship, no matter how well armored, was safe from the new German weapon. The German shell had rewritten the rules of naval warfare, and the British were now facing a threat they had never imagined. But for the Germans, the success of the Bismarck and its weapons was a moment of triumph. They had created a weapon that could destroy anything in its path, even the most powerful warships in the world. The precision of the fuse, the power of the explosive charge, and the design of the shell itself had all come together to create a weapon of unmatched destruction. The German engineers, who had worked tirelessly to perfect these shells, could now see their creation in action. The weapon had proven itself in battle, and the German Navy had a new tool in its arsenal that would change the course of the war. However, the victory was bittersweet. While the Germans had proven the effectiveness of their new weapon, the Bismarck's success in the Denmark Strait would be short-lived. Just days after the sinking of the Hood, the British Navy launched a relentless pursuit of the Bismarck, determined to destroy it. The Bismarck's victory over the Hood would be its last. On May 27, 1941, the Bismarck was sunk by a combination of British ships and aircraft. But the legacy of the deadly shells and the devastation they caused would live on long after the ship itself was gone. The destruction of the Hood was not just a turning point in the battle between the Bismarck and the Royal Navy. It marked a larger shift in naval warfare, where the power of these new, precision-engineered weapons would forever change the tactics and strategies of naval battles. The deadly shells that had been developed in the steelworks of Essen had proven their worth, but at what cost? The sinking of the Hood showed just how terrifying and unstoppable these weapons could be. And as the war raged on, the world would continue to witness the terrifying power of these shells, as they sank ships, shattered crews, and changed the face of naval combat forever. In the aftermath of the Hood's destruction, the British Navy realized that their previous understanding of naval combat had to evolve. No longer could they rely solely on the strength of their ship's armor or the size of their guns. The new reality was clear. The weapons of war were becoming more precise, more powerful, and more deadly. And the world had only just begun to see the full impact of this new era in naval warfare. The battle had not only proven the superiority of the German weapon, but it had also shown the vulnerability of even the mightiest ships. From that moment on, the course of naval combat would never be the same. As the war progressed, it became clear that the devastation caused by the German shells was just the beginning. The shells, designed with precision and deadly force, had already proven their effectiveness in combat, but their true potential had not yet been fully realized. The destruction of the HMS Hood had shown the world just how powerful these weapons were, but there was more to come. The Germans knew that to win the war, they needed to refine these shells even further, making them even more deadly. The key to their success was not just in their ability to penetrate armor, but in the devastation they caused once inside the ship. This was the next challenge that German engineers set out to conquer. The shells had already proven they could punch through even the thickest armor, But the engineers now focused on maximizing the damage once the shell had breached the ship. They knew that the real vulnerability of any warship wasn't just the hull, it was everything inside the engines, the ammunition, the crew. The Germans realized that the key to sinking a ship wasn't just about getting through the outer defenses, it was about spreading destruction throughout the entire ship, tearing apart its inner workings and killing everything in its path. The explosive charge inside the shell was already powerful, but the Germans wanted more. They needed to create a shell that would unleash its full destructive potential once it had penetrated the ship. The solution was simple but brutal. The shell was designed to create secondary explosions once it detonated. When the shell's explosive charge went off, it didn't just create a single explosion. It sent out thousands of high-speed fragments, pieces of the shell casing that were propelled outward at speeds greater than 3,000 feet per second. These fragments were essentially flying bullets, capable of slicing through steel bulkheads, pipes, wiring, and flesh. The impact of these fragments was devastating. They would ricochet off surfaces, tearing through the ship's interior, creating more explosions as they hit fuel, ammunition, or other volatile materials. The result was a chain reaction of destruction. One shell hit could set off a series of explosions that spread throughout the ship, turning it into a death trap for everyone inside. The fragments didn't just destroy the ship's internal structure, they killed anyone unlucky enough to be in their path. The crew had no chance to escape. The damage was so overwhelming that it left the ship completely uninhabitable. The crew's only hope was to abandon ship before the destruction could reach them. The Japanese learned this lesson the hard way at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944. American battleships, armed with the same type of shells, engaged the Japanese center force. The shells were so heavy and moving so fast that even near misses could cause massive damage. Many of the shells didn't even hit the ships directly. Instead, they struck below the waterline, creating huge holes in the hulls. The force of the explosion, combined with the flooding, was unstoppable. Even though the ships weren't hit directly, the damage was catastrophic. The shells would continue to explode long after the initial impact, creating a cascading effect of destruction that no one could stop. The effectiveness of these shells went beyond what anyone had expected. They could destroy ships from the inside out, creating chaos and destruction in ways that were almost unimaginable. The German engineers had created a weapon that could break through even the toughest defenses, then tear apart everything inside. The shells were now a symbol of the new reality of naval warfare. The age of relying solely on armor and firepower was over. In this new world, precision, engineering, and destruction from within were the keys to victory. But the Germans weren't done yet. They knew that they had created something powerful, but they were determined to make it even better. The next step in the evolution of these shells was to increase their effectiveness even further. The German military began experimenting with new types of shells that could cause even more damage. They introduced incendiary compounds, materials designed not just to explode but to burn. These new shells were loaded with white phosphorus and thermite chemicals that burned at such high temperatures that they couldn't be extinguished with water. White phosphorus ignited on contact with air and continued burning even underwater. Thermite, on the other hand, burned at over 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, capable of melting through steel like butter. The Germans used these new incendiary shells to create even more devastation. These shells didn't just sink ships, they turned them into crematoriums. Even if the crew survived the initial explosion, they wouldn't survive the fires that followed. The flames would continue to burn long after the shell had detonated. The British, during the firebombing of the German battleship Tirpitz in 1944, experienced this terrifying effect firsthand. The Lancaster bombers dropped massive tallboy bombs, not even needing to hit the ship directly. The shockwaves from the near misses caused structural damage, and then the fire started. The ship was destroyed from within as the fire consumed everything, cooking off ammunition and melting equipment. Even though the Tirpitz was in shallow water and couldn't sink, she was rendered irreparable. The fire had taken everything from her. These new incendiary shells were the ultimate expression of the destructive power the Germans had harnessed. They weren't just about sinking ships anymore. They were about turning entire ships into infernos, leaving nothing but twisted metal, charred bodies, and a burning wreck. The shells had become more than just weapons. They had become instruments of total destruction. The question now was how to keep improving them. How could the Germans make their shells even more effective, even more deadly? They experimented with different ways to increase the explosive power, better control the detonation, and enhance the penetration. They worked on designing fuses that would ensure the shells detonated at the perfect moment, ensuring maximum destruction. The goal was clear: to create the most powerful naval shells the world had ever seen. But as the war raged on, the Germans faced a new challenge. The introduction of aircraft with torpedoes and bombs created a new threat to battleships. These new weapons could strike from above, bypassing the thick armor of the battleships entirely. The once unstoppable might of the battleships was now under threat from above. The age of the battleship, and with it, the shells designed to destroy them, was coming to an end. The Germans had created a weapon of unimaginable power, but by the time it was perfected, the weapon itself was becoming obsolete. The shells that had once changed naval warfare would now be left behind. But their legacy lived on in the engineers who had created them. They had crafted a weapon capable of unparalleled destruction, and though it would eventually be overshadowed by new technologies, its impact would never be forgotten. These shells had been the last word in naval firepower. But as history would show, the end of the battleship also marked the end of this terrifying era of naval warfare. By the time the war reached its final years, the world had already witnessed the devastating impact of the German naval shells. These shells had rewritten the rules of naval warfare, and their power had been demonstrated time and again. They had torn apart ships, killed thousands, and left a legacy of destruction. But as the war drew to a close, the very weapons that had changed the course of naval battles were becoming less and less relevant. The era of the battleship was ending, and with it, the dominance of these massive shells. The final years of the war saw the development of new weapons and tactics that would render the battleship obsolete. Aircraft, with their ability to strike from above, bypassing the thick armor of battleships, now dominated the skies. Bombers armed with torpedoes and bombs could attack ships from a distance, avoiding the heavy artillery that had once been the primary threat. Even the most powerful shells were no match for the speed and precision of aerial strikes. The very ships that had once been the kings of the seas were now vulnerable to weapons that cost a fraction of what it took to build a battleship. This shift in warfare marked the end of an era. The final battle between battleships, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, in October 1944, was the last time the world would see such weapons used in anger. The Japanese battleships, which had once ruled the seas, were now facing off against American ships armed with newer, more advanced technology. The American battleships, using radar-guided fire control systems and their own versions of armor-piercing shells, managed to destroy the Japanese ships. But even as the shells tore through the Japanese ships' thick armor, the world was already moving toward a new kind of warfare. The battleship, once the symbol of naval power, was now a relic of the past. The Germans had already recognized the changing tides of war. In the final stages of the conflict, they experimented with new types of shells and weapons that could help them compete with the rising power of aircraft. Some of these new designs included shells with additional incendiary compounds, such as white phosphorus and thermite. These materials burned at incredibly high temperatures, capable of melting through steel and causing fires that couldn't be extinguished. The goal was to create a shell that didn't just penetrate armor, but burned through it, turning entire ships into blazing infernos. But by the time these new designs were perfected, the era of battleships had already passed. The introduction of these new weapons, combined with the increasing dominance of air power, meant that the battleship was no longer the centerpiece of naval fleets. Even the most advanced shells, like the German 15-inch and 16-inch armor-piercing shells, couldn't stop the new threat from the skies. The battleships were too slow, too vulnerable, and too expensive to continue as the main force in naval warfare. The era of giant ships, armed with massive guns and deadly shells, was drawing to a close. In the aftermath of the war, the surviving battleships were either scrapped or converted into museum pieces. The shells that had once been the ultimate weapon in naval combat were abandoned, dumped into the ocean by the thousands, still alive, still dangerous. These shells, which had once been the key to victory, now lay dormant at the bottom of the sea, reminders of a time when naval power was measured by the size of the guns and the thickness of the armor. The German engineers who had designed these shells knew that they had created something powerful, but they also knew that they had created something that would eventually be rendered obsolete. The rapid advancements in air power and the rise of guided missiles meant that the battleships they had worked so hard to perfect would no longer dominate the seas. The shells, despite their incredible power, were doomed to become relics of a bygone era. Yet, even though the battleship was no longer the centerpiece of naval fleets, the legacy of these shells lived on. The precision engineering that went into their design influenced future developments in artillery and ammunition. The concept of creating a shell that could penetrate even the thickest armor while causing maximum destruction inside would continue to influence the development of military technology. The engineers who had crafted these deadly shells had laid the groundwork for future generations of weapons, and their legacy would live on in the technologies that followed. In the years after the war, as the world moved into the Cold War and beyond, the principles of precision and destructive power that had been embodied by these shells continued to influence military strategy. The rise of new technologies, such as nuclear weapons and advanced missile systems, made traditional naval warfare seem almost outdated. But the lessons learned from the shells of the past still resonated in the weapons of the future. The concept of creating a weapon that could do more than just destroy, one that could tear apart entire ships, create secondary explosions, and spread devastation, would continue to shape the future of warfare. Today, the legacy of these shells remains, not only in military history, but in the way we view the evolution of technology and warfare. The shells themselves are now artifacts, displayed in museums or lying at the bottom of the ocean. But the story of how they were created and the devastating impact they had on naval warfare is a reminder of the power of human ingenuity and the destructive potential that comes with it. These shells were designed not just to destroy ships, but to change the very nature of war, and in that they succeeded.